Hi everyone, welcome to the Hearing Homelessness podcast series, where we'll be discussing local homelessness and the complexities of the homeless experience. My name is Alyssa Enns, and I'm the project leader for the Leamington Homelessness Project at South Essex Community Council, and I'll be your host for this podcast series. Today I'm joined by Colm Holmes and Ashley Nelson to discuss the complexities of the homelessness experience from a service provider's point of view.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you for having me. So my name is Colm Holmes. As mentioned, I work at Family Services Windsor Essex. I am currently the coordinator of a housing first intervention program called Windsor Essex Housing Connections, and I've been doing this work for roughly around 7 years, and I couldn't be any more happy to be here today.
My name is Ashley Nelson, and I'm the program coordinator of the Bridge Youth Resource Center. The Bridge is a local hub for youth services. We have a drop-in program and supportive housing for youth ages 16 to 24, really trying to just provide that wraparound support for youth who are in need. And I have been in housing and homelessness services for almost 6 years locally.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you both so much for being here. I'm really excited to have you both. I think we're going to have a lot to talk about, so we'll just kind of hop right into the questions, if that's all good.
Sounds good.
All right, so just to kind of get us started here, from your perspective, where does the homelessness service system work well, and where do you see room for improvement?
So,
I think, over the past few years, there's, especially since, the by names list came in, I think that was a really big, so the by names list came in 2018, so I think when that came in, there was really, an integration of supports, and, it's only continued to increase.
yes. And so, for those who may not be familiar with the by names prioritized list, it is what is called a centralized access point for services, where everyone experiencing homelessness, with their consent, of course, gets added to a by names prioritized list, and then services are matched to people's needs. And that list is basically numerous agencies getting together bi-weekly in order to match people to services that will help them exit homelessness in a way that suits their needs. And so, as Ashley mentioned, yes, of course, that definitely is a huge piece for our system to have coordination together instead of everybody kind of haphazardly doing what they can to combat the issue. When we talk about kind of what works well in the sector and what isn't working so well, homelessness is tough. It is hard work, right? So looking at what works well, I look at a lot of the different interconnected pieces. So from the social service aspect, if people are on assistance, they're on Ontario Works, they're on Ontario Disability, there's some great parts of that help people exit homelessness. Of course, community-based charitable organizations that are doing the work, like the Bridge, like Family Services, and numerous other agencies across our region. It's important for us to be in a coordinated manner, so I do think that those pieces do work really well. There are lots of available resources out there for folks as well when it comes to, once they've secured a place, getting furniture, any of the kind of pieces that need to be met for somebody's basic needs to be fulfilled. So those pieces, I think, really do work well together. There's always going to be a need for more of those services and more coordination, and I think as our region works together more and more in such an intricate way, hopefully the system will continue to, help people in need in an effective manner.
I think Colm said it amazingly. The more we continue to work together for people, and the more people are put on the by names list or by names prioritized list, the more we locate people who are experiencing homelessness and slipping through the gaps. I think that's where it's at.
Yeah, definitely. I think that coordination piece is huge, and like you said, Ashley, with people slipping through the cracks, coordination is one of the best ways to combat that, right? So
Absolutely.
I totally agree with you both. I think that's great. And just sort of, building this out a little bit, when it comes to a system having so many moving parts, obviously there are going to be sort of obstacles and barriers that come with that. Could either of you speak to what the major obstacles to providing support for those experiencing homelessness are?
So there's many different obstacles, right? So if you have somebody who's in shelter or there's individuals up in, and I think Colm can also speak to this, there's individuals who can be not able to access certain shelters. So if we're like there's obstacles in that sense. And so if one set of the system isn't speaking to the other, that has changed since HIFIS has kind of come up.
I'll just add in a little bit
Oh,
about,
no,
HIFIS.
go ahead.
About
I
HIFIS,
don't
right?
work with
Just because it
HIFIS,
could
so
be
you do.
it could be a little bit confusing, but it's basically an information system that is used in the homelessness sector, and it's used across Canada. Windsor Essex has, really tried for a long
Yes.
time to get it going. At our agency, we're new to it,
Yeah.
so we're new in the game. But in general, as Ashley mentioned, it's again another coordinated communication system where you can know where somebody actually last stayed in a shelter, went into a homelessness drop-in program, access to food bank. It really tells you a lot, and it helps obviously us find those individuals that we're struggling to connect with.
Yeah. And it's really good for outreach purposes, as Colin said. Like, it's, I think, again, the coordination piece is a huge relieves those barriers.
For sure. Something like HIFIS would be huge too, because I know through our agency we see that sometimes you're only connecting with someone who's experiencing homelessness, very infrequently, whether that's like a month or even every few months. Sometimes you'll, see someone a couple times in a year, right?
Yeah.
So I think that piece is huge for even if you're not like directly connecting with that individual, at least you kind of are able to touch base and see where they're at as well, right?
Absolutely. And so then when we, barriers, there's a long list, right?
Yes, of course.
We could talk about, of course, poverty being a major one, right? Access to actual affordable housing for folks is a major, major barrier that we have locally. Mental health, addictions,
I think
those pieces are huge with regards to barriers.
just like the intersectionality of low income, right? Like, if you're looking at somebody who is getting out of incarceration and like what that process looks like, right? Like, if they're getting out on a Friday and welcome to the Welcome Center, welcome to Salvation Army, like that's quite an intersectionality of.
And then there's, of course, people's abilities to even access congregate settings for living, right? So that's where we do see people living in non-traditional means, like in alleyways or in encampment settings, right? So that's another big piece around some of the barriers. It's harder to connect with those folks because of that, right? So as you mentioned, there could be some time where you only meet with somebody that's experiencing homelessness a few times in a couple-month period. That's because homelessness is so tough, right? They're surviving.
For
That's
sure.
what they're doing, right? And so when survival is your main thing and your priority is getting a meal today, accessing a bathroom, finding a shower maybe getting a clean pair of socks, your priority isn't needing to do some paperwork with a case manager somewhere. And that's totally understandable, right? So people are intricate beings, and so as much as we would love for them to make housing as much of a priority as we're trying to, sometimes people can't.
And then
Right.
to speak on what Colin's saying, like, it's survival for today, and then it's also survival, like, you have no idea what's going on tomorrow. And, right, like, we can put on, like, you need to work on housing as hard as we are working on housing for you, but they are surviving for today. And I think sometimes we have to be in person-centered care of this is what your situation is, and sometimes we have to remove ourselves and really focus on this is what your situation is.
And that's such a good transition into like housing first as a model,
Yeah.
right? Because that's something that I kind of hold my stake on, right? Is that the values in and the principles of housing first, they read that, right? Like, so the client is the captain of the ship, the caseworker is on board. The caseworker can let the client know when there's a storm approaching, but if the client decides we're going through that storm, and maybe in like a realistic way instead of a metaphor, like we're going to go forward with an eviction, we're not going to change our behavior, the case manager's staying on board.
Yeah.
Right? So we lose housing, we stay with the person.
Yeah.
We find housing again. And when we find housing again, we work with people, and we have to recognize that we're actually the fortunate ones to be alongside their journey. Right? Because people are letting us into a very intimate, intricate part of their lives. There's a whole bunch of stigma around mental health, around homelessness, around substance use. Those things are compounded on folks, right? So I think in general, we are the privileged ones to be able to work with these folks because they're peeling back layers of trauma. They're telling us a lot about what's going on in their lives. And so if people's journey isn't as quick as we would like it to be, that's kind of an ego check on our own. We have to check that piece, right?
Sure.
It's no 100%. Like, sometimes I like to. It's like an onion, right? Like, sometimes you peel it back and you don't realize how deep that trauma is, especially with people who've dealt with like chronic homelessness. And right, sometimes you may go through many tendencies because it takes time to adapt to the fact that they haven't lived, right? Like I can move into an apartment and I know, right, I've gone through Rent Smart, I've gone through all of financial literacy, I've gone through those programs, so I know how to pay my rent on time, and I know those things. I know what it is to have paid a deposit. But if you don't have those life skills,
Of course. It's very true, right? And so some of those pieces, and that's actually the real beauty in Housing First, is the continued support after their house. Without that, that's where people come back to the system so often, right? So giving people long-term supports, in addition to prioritizing housing, is something I get to witness and I get to see the benefits of, right? And so individuals, for example, somebody that was housed by the outreach team recently was 10 years homelessness in the streets. And I remember from my early days doing the work as a street outreach worker, engaging with this individual, and they weren't there. They weren't ready to be in any way, shape, or form working with me. They weren't able to. They weren't interested. Every time I asked them, like, why don't we get you on Ontario Works or get you some income? I work. Okay. And then literally, as I'm in now 7 years later, a colleague of mine housed this gentleman, and I said to her, like, you've just changed somebody's life monumentally. And the duration period of somebody's homelessness doesn't make it any more rewarding, but a decade in the streets of Windsor, I think, was something to be really celebrated, right? And so it's important for us to recognize that no matter what, you are actually moving mountains, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that trauma piece too, right? Like, I mean, the research shows that so many folks who are experiencing homelessness are already coming from past with trauma. And then that doesn't even touch on the fact that the experience of homelessness itself is a traumatic one, right? So you talked about Housing First and, expecting people to solve all of their housing problems.
Or move into a place and just, like...
Be great.
Yeah, everything will be great.
Exactly. It's just, it's setting people up for failure, almost to put that on them as an expectation.
Absolutely. And that's why I always tell people, right, when there's new case managers, when there's people coming on board, like, this is value-based work. People don't roll up their sleeves and get into homelessness because they think it's a good paycheck. They get into it because they want to help others. They really do have a value-based passion around, ending chronic homelessness and eradicating even a homelessness experience one at a time. And so
that's what it really is it's that one at a time.
Big time. Big time, absolutely.
Sometimes, like, each day is there's going to be something different. So you can't look at it as I'm going to house a person a day, because that's not going to happen.
No, it really isn't.
Especially not in urban housing.
Yeah, the market helps a little bit too with dictating how effective we can be. But in general, right, like, people, as I mentioned, they are the ones that dictate their lives. They are the ones that are in control. And we are the ones that can help facilitate some things that might have been a little harder for them to navigate. Right? But at the end of the day, caseworkers, people that are from agencies that are knocking on doors, that are engaging with people, we are seeing a tiny bit of someone's life. We are not seeing the full scope of what they've been through, their past, even their current, right? You've seen somebody for an hour a week. How much are you really getting to know them?
For sure.
And so a line I used to do when I did direct service delivery was I used to say, how could I possibly know you better than you? Right? Because that is, it's just, there's no chance I could, right? So I'm not going to make a plan for you. You're going to make a plan, and we're going to execute it together. Right? People are way more apt to follow their own plans, and that is the beauty in this work, is when you see somebody develop a plan and execute it, you can stand on the sidelines and just clap, like, you did everything you needed to do, right? And so, and that's how people build more confidence. That's how people get, more integrated into their community, find meaningful routines in their lives. If they don't have a little bit of a framework, they won't be able to ever go for those pieces, right? So it is important to prioritize somebody just having a stable place to call, home is a very big deal.
Yeah, definitely. I want to kind of unpack this whole Housing First approach a little bit further.
Absolutely.
We've kind of talked about it, a little bit about what it is, a little bit about why it's important. So I want to bring wraparound supports kind of into that conversation as well. So how are wraparound supports connected to a Housing First approach, and why is it so crucial to create space to address the other challenges in someone's life when we talk about solving chronic homelessness?
Okay, so if
somebody
is homeless, how are they supposed to stabilize? I think that's, to me, is the biggest thing.
Yeah,
so if you're somebody's actively homeless, they're just working on survival.
Exactly.
And the piece too is to understand the beauty in housing first is to really a little bit understand how it was done historically, right? And so we used to have what is called compliance-based service, basically, right? And so you were rewarded with housing if you were a good person and you did your job and you took your meds for your mental health, or you went to your AA and you stayed off the drink, whatever it may be, right? That was how housing worked. So somebody went from, let's say, the streets into shelter, from shelter into transitional. They checked all the boxes in transitional, and then they were rewarded with independent housing. And then, of course, all that pressure, and anytime somebody failed, they went back to square one. And we recognized our system is not doing anything for anyone. It's really just circling around. And mostly the same group of people. No one are ever really trying to challenge the people that need the services the most because they're too hard to help, right? And so now, with this model, it's forget all that. There is no housing readiness requirements. There is none of that. You know how I know somebody needs housing? They don't have it. That's it.
Yeah.
I don't need to know if they're taking their meds. I don't need to know if their usage is too high. Those pieces are separate from somebody requiring housing. And they shouldn't be looked at as a way of preventing somebody from accessing an opportunity to actually be a tenant, right? And so what happens is that when you tell somebody we're going to just search for housing, it is an amazing conversation because they're not used to that. What do you mean? Are you like, let's go looking at apartments? Okay, sounds great. And so from there, when they actually get into their place, the supports then they start to look at other pieces. We might say, okay, we do think that Johnny, for example, just pulling a name out of my hat, you need mental health supports. But if that's not where he's at in his journey, then we're not going to do that. And so I always tell people, whatever their first thing they want to do after they get keys to their place, let's try really hard to execute that. And sometimes that's let's get a cat, and sometimes that's let me talk to my psychiatrist about my meds. So it really depends, but we have to put the same passion behind both pieces. Even if the getting the cat isn't what we'd really love for Johnny, that doesn't matter. We're getting the cat because we have to set up somebody with the ability to develop a home, develop a tenancy that they're willing to fight for. Right?
For sure.
And that's really how you build up people keeping their tenancies, is making them value them.
And like the great thing about the Housing First program is that you have landlord developers that work with it. Like you have other key parts of the program, not just caseworkers. So you have landlord developers that go actually work with the landlords. So you have it from both sides. So just to help keep that tenancy.
And the wraparound supports, it's not just like, okay, if somebody gets housed and you give them a social worker, everything's going to be great. The social worker has to deliver the intervention in a trauma-informed way, client-led, person-centered, recovery-oriented. Those pieces have to be there. That is the beauty in Housing First. The folks we're talking about, the individuals that have had the longest experiences of homelessness in our region, the individuals that have the most visits to the hospital, the most visits to our Southwest Detention Center, those are the individuals that are going to require a trauma-informed, a really committed individual that's going to deliver value-based service.
Like individuals don't have to be, like it's harm reduction based, so people do not have to be what's the word?
Sober? Abstinent?
Sober. Thank you.
Yeah.
Like that's the
The threat, like there used to be a threshold requirement around you
but
can't
now
be,
there isn't,
using, and
which is really terrific.
harm reduction is critical.
Yeah,
Critical.
definitely.
It has to be embedded.
So
For sure.
they don't have to be housing ready, as Colin said. Like it's
Yeah, there isn't any requirements. If somebody was going to use because they stayed in a shelter and they get housed, they're probably still going to use.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
my mentality with it, and harm reduction is really something that I will always champion, always. Because I've had the benefit of harm reduction giving me really, really rich conversations when I'm sitting with somebody who feels like, you know what, Colin has laid out a framework around a non-judgmental setting for me to be open about my use.
For sure.
And then when I'm visiting somebody on a weekly basis, they could say, hey, you know what, my use has gone up really bad. I'm not feeling great about myself. But they felt like the door was open to have that conversation because I said it from the tone that, hey, if you're going to have a bunch of people over and they're using in your unit, we need naloxone present. If you're going to be, sharing substances with people, we need to make sure you have safe supplies. Even harm reduction can be something as simple as making a plan with someone around safety. What would you do if somebody passed out in your unit that used? And do you have a neighbor you would feel okay knocking on their door asking them to call 911? like setting up some frameworks and then actioning it for anybody if those things ever happen.
Yeah.
Right? So it's about, giving people armed knowledge so they can make informed decisions.
Yeah, for sure, and allowing them to keep that agency,
Yeah.
right? Which is something I feel like has been a little bit of a theme with some of the practices that we're talking about, even when it comes to, like, is Johnny gonna get a cat, or what is his first move going to be? But, allowing people to keep that agency, I think, is so important.
Which I think with homelessness, they lose that agency, right?
For
So
sure.
it's helping them regain it.
In every avenue,
Exactly.
right? Choice is stripped of people experiencing
Yeah.
homelessness.
Yeah,
Period.
for sure.
Right? And so, as I mentioned, when I first started this work, I was doing street outreach. So would go into encampments, and I made sure to any avenue I could instill choice in, I would. And so that sounds basic, but sometimes it would be like, do you want the blue or the red gloves? Right? Because I wanted to send a signal to folks that I believed that they had the proper ability to make choice in their own lives.
Yeah.
And then the bigger one was, hey, where do you want to live? Where do you want me to start looking for apartments?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think you could do? You think a bachelor in the East End is really, it's going to be tough, right? And then you start to widen, of course, the area, but you start shooting for the stars.
Yeah.
Where would you
definitely.
love to live by? What is important to you? Why do I need you to be in that area, right? And then you go for that. So choice is impeccable, and it's very important to reinstill to people's lives. For an example, if I check into the shelter, right, I have to check in at a certain time, right? So then that's telling me when I have to go to bed at night, basically, right? Who I'm sleeping next to, and I know that these rules are in order, and they're important to, be able to run a shelter, which is something I have never done. But I do recognize that choice is taken, and so the time you go to bed, who you're sleeping near, when you're waking up, what you're having for breakfast, when your access to a shower is going to happen. More than likely, the clothes on you are the ones that you have, so you're going to be wearing that. So that's another choice you don't get, right? And so the amount of money that's coming into your bank account, all these things are kind of done for you. They've been decided, right? And so really, we're asking people to, jump on the train of getting housed and this and that, but really they're used to just being told what everything has to happen for them. So any avenue of reinstating choice, I really think is important for our folks. And then also recognizing the choice that we probably sometimes take for granted in our own lives, right? I wake up, I can decide if I want to have breakfast first or take the shower. I can look into a closet full of clothing and choose what outfit I would like to have. And so I think it's about understanding that. Access to a bathroom.
Yeah.
Something as simple as access to a bathroom, right? So there are lots of things that run through the mind of someone experiencing homelessness that people that are fortunate enough to have stable housing sometimes are just ignorant to.
And
right?
I also think it's, especially in our current times and inflation, we don't realize how simple it or how easy it is to be a paycheck away.
Yeah.
And
For sure.
Or, being evicted. I don't think,
the stability of housing has gotten even less.
The stability of housing has gotten even less. Or a lot of people on the streets were evicted and then just couldn't find something.
Yeah.
That may not speak for all the chronically homeless individuals, but I think we have to be fortunate we have to remember to be fortunate for what we have.
Absolutely. I know one thing that's quite common in our area as well, or that I've been hearing of lately, is you'll see a lot of people who have been living in their homes for years, decades, whatever it is, and obviously the housing market has changed a lot since then. So, they're evicted maybe for renovations or whatever that is. Either way, they're looking for a new place with half the budget, essentially, right?
Yep.
So that makes things really complicated for people too.
And so for me, I look at it as the system. The system of housing, the housing system across our country
For sure.
is not designed for people living in poverty in any way, shape, or form, right? And what it's actually designed to do is to get them further and further away from it.
Yeah.
Right? And as we see that, even people have living wage, they could easily be squeezed out or even never access the housing market, right? So it's not designed. It's a profitable commodity-based system that has no heart for helping the homeless, but it's a profit center, and I understand that. But it has gotten to a point where it's unreachable, and the rates, which is another system piece around social services in Canada, haven't grown in forever. People cannot live off of Ontario Works or off of Ontario Disability. They can't. It's very hard. And so,
Or find room rentals, right? Like you're searching on Kijiji or Facebook Marketplace, or right? Like it's extremely. I know with the Windsor Essex Housing Connections, you have landlord developers, and that's an asset. But
we're still checking every day,
Right,
Because
but
the lack of
it's-
housing is so rampant,
yeah,
really, right?
but truly, it's Ontario Works and ODSP are it's not.
Like even out here, let's say, like
Yeah.
for a rural example,
Uh-huh,
right?
uh-huh.
I'm a county kid myself. I reside in Amherstburg. The average apartment in Leamington right now is probably $1,000.
Yeah,
If
I
not
would
more,
say
right?
I would say
more.
you're like almost bare minimum is like 1,000 right now, right?
$1,000.
Yeah.
$1,000.
Right, and an
Yeah.
individual on ODSP gets 1,000, 1,100, what, 19?
Yeah.
Right, you get $119 less.
So food bank access. But like when we talk about, people's like a third of their income being, right? Like
Yeah.
that's not a tangible thing for people living
No.
below the poverty line. It's just not.
And then
an
you
option.
have an increase of food bank access, and right, so everything else just increases.
The system gets strained even harder,
Yes, for
right?
sure.
So
For sure.
it is tough, and I agree. Like finding those apartments even is so hard
Yeah.
to do, right? It's very difficult, and at the end of the day, it's going to continue to be so as we see rising costs. Because what's happening is people that used to be maybe a different like echelon of housing are having to take that step down because of the squeeze around inflation and everything else. So there's going to be more people looking for the same apartments, right? And that makes it even harder for for them to take a gamble on one of our folks that we're really hoping could get a shot, right?
Absolutely. As we've kind of touched on already, or I guess it's been a common theme throughout our discussion, there are a ton of moving parts that obviously complicate how easy it is to support folks on their journey with homelessness.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's one thing to be dealing with housing, but lots of people are dealing with other exceptionalities at the same time, right? So we know that this is an intersectional experience, and there are a lot of structural vulnerabilities for people. So I'm wondering how the complexity and intersectionality of these experiences affects people's ability to access the supports they need, which we've kind of talked about a little bit, but just kind of diving into that a bit further.
So I think that, especially from a street outreach point of view, you're starting almost at, ground zero because the trust just isn't there.
Right.
We're talking about systems that have let people down traditionally over time, and so they're discouraged. They are not in any way, shape, or form motivated. They are, lacking trust. And I have to tell, the team that I work with that we are part of that system. So they see us as that, and we are always going to be part of the system.
Right.
So it's our job to figure out ways to gain that trust back. And so there are lots of approaches around the way you even communicate with folks, the way you engage, that really will produce results around gaining people's trust. And some people will be more reserved and have stronger walls up, and some people will, be a little bit more open a little quicker. But it really is at their own pace. We're walking next to people, right? We're not pulling anybody along, and we're definitely not pushing anybody. So it's about kind of letting people trust you when they're good and ready to. And then you can kind of slowly start to tell them, I know you told me that your experience with this part of the system was really terrible, but maybe we try this together and see if we get a little bit of better results. Sometimes you have to move people inches, right? They're not quite ready to tackle massive things that have hurt them in the past. And so people being, dismissed or not getting the proper, attention and value that they should be getting allows people to not want to engage, right? Just like as we are human. If we have a negative experience, we're going to avoid, right? So it's the same can be said for the folks that we find in our community.
No, I can speak from like the youth perspective. Like it's again, each individual's experience is completely their own, but I think with trauma, it can be it's inches. Like it can be some can be ready for counseling at this point, but if they're not, they're not. And then with like housing, like once they are housed, you can start to work on other things. But yeah, it's really like a step at a time, but you have to be taking those steps with them.
and taking into account, right, trauma, and taking into account sometimes that a lot of, university educated individuals doing this work are very far removed from these experiences.
Absolutely.
I am quick and honest to name that with people.
Absolutely.
I don't know what it's like to use crystal meth. I don't know what it's like to not know where I'm going to stay tonight.
Mhm.
I don't know those things. And I think that...
I'm not in your shoes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think we have to be very honest about that, because
Absolutely.
we, at the end of the day, we're not in this experience.
People will tell you, right? The people from the street, they know what's genuine and what's not.
Yeah.
They
for
have
sure.
they had to learn skill sets,
Right.
right? It's
The
not
more
an easy thing.
authentic you are, the better you're going to be able to build trust with people.
Absolutely.
Because they, especially youth, people who have been able to make it on the streets for as long as they can, they know, as Colm said, what's true, what's not.
Without a doubt. Genuine, are you there just because you want to be doing the job,
Yeah.
or are you there because you actually want to help the person,
Absolutely.
right? And so, like I said, this is tough work, right? Roll up your sleeves, be ready for tough days, be ready for people failing and you having to continue to support them even when they're making decisions you don't agree with. That's too bad.
Yeah.
That's their abilities, right?
Yeah.
We have to let them have that ability. And so, for me, I always tell people, remind yourself when you're in a space with someone you're supporting that person should get every part of you.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's what we would want for ourselves if we were ever in their shoes.
Absolutely. And it's like you said, it's a privilege to be there standing alongside them for that experience.
100%.
Right? And I think it makes it more of a privilege when you're able to do it, I guess knowing that people have been consistently failed by these systems and that you can maybe be some positive asset of that in that experience
Huge,
for them,
huge.
right?
And it's about what are wins and how are we
Mhm.
defining wins,
Yeah.
right? And so I remember, in the early days of kind of Southwest had just opened the detention center, and I was supporting a gentleman, and I would go in there and I would visit, and one of the guards said, "I can't believe there was such a gap between the last time he was here." Right?
It's a win.
Yeah.
And I thought in my head, I was like, he's so right. When I first started working with this gentleman, he was going to jail pretty much every 60 days.
Yeah.
That was just 9-month run with no jail.
Wow.
Right? So we have to start recognizing that, right? And then when he returns out so that was 9 months. That was awesome. How do we make a year?
Yeah.
What is it that we can do?
Yeah.
Right? And so it's those
It's-
small wins.
Yeah, and I think, right, each individual, you have to define their wins by them. If they're defining it as a win, we're defining it as
You
a
got
win.
it.
Mhm.
Yep.
Right?
Mhm.
And I think that's the really, right, if somebody gets housed, we define, that's a win. For me,
Absolutely.
sometimes I'm more excited than they are, but for me, that's a win.
Absolutely.
And I think every day, if you have a win, that's awesome. If the client has a falter, that's not your falter.
Mhm.
Because if you're taking that on as yours, then
We have what's called supportive fails. That's what we call it.
Okay.
Right?
Mhm.
So it's like, even if we know somebody's failing, we continue to support.
Yeah.
Maybe they get more visits that week because things are going hard.
Yeah.
Right? We have to be compassionate. That's how this
Yeah.
work is really done well, right? Is compassion-based work.
exactly.
So for me, it's like, if they fail, what can we pull from that? There has to be some sort of silver lining in there.
Making it a learning
Whatever it is that
opportunity.
we can pull. Whatever
Yeah.
it might be, a small lesson that they learn. Anything, right? Anything that they can pull to make the next tenancy better. But I'm constantly telling people that losing your housing doesn't mean that you lose your worker.
Mm-hmm.
The services and the housing are not one, right? The services are consistent and they're
Mm-hmm.
staying with you for, years. That's the only way that we'll actually have people recover from homelessness.
Mhm.
Right.
Because it really is tiring.
It is.
Right.
But it's
Yeah.
also tiring for them, right? We have individuals who want to keep their tenancies, and
Of course.
yes, things happen, and we have to be compassionate to the fact that there's trauma, there's mental health, there's addictions, and we have to be compassionate to all of that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and there's no sense penalizing someone if they quote unquote fail, right?
Right.
Like, I love the idea of supported fails. I think that's a great concept.
Mhm.
And I mean, what a great way to celebrate someone still showing up and trying to make progress regardless of what that
Always.
looks like, right?
Always.
So I think that's huge. We've kind of touched on this a little bit with this whole trust element, but how do these things sort of impact your relationships with clients? Or is there anything, I guess, that's to note for that?
So, I mean, it's about asserting that, right? So, like I mentioned, even when we're adding in choice, we're sending a signal of trust.
Mm-hmm.
because we're saying, I trust you to make choice in your life, right? And the second you tell people that you trust their decision making, now they're going to start to build a little bit of trust your way. It might be smaller and it might take a little bit longer, but I've had people that were shocked that I just kept showing up, even when they had really terrible days or they fired me 1,000 times or any of those things, right? Well, I always like to confirm you really want to fire me. And that's important, right? And I think there's part of that connection, right? If you connect with somebody and you let them know, hey, listen, I'm going to keep showing up. I had a gentleman say to me, do you know how many assault charges I have? I can't believe you keep showing up, and you're really little. And I said, yeah, but you wouldn't hurt me. And he's going, no, I wouldn't. And the day he got housed, he said, for such a little body, he got a huge heart. And I said, you know what? It's not even about that, right? It's you just needed someone to give you a little bit of help to get through this. This is all on you. You did all this. You showed up to every appointment. You made it happen. You needed to get bank records. You needed to do this. You did all those things. So sometimes people will deflect negative things, and they'll also deflect positive things because they're not used to being recognized for any goodwill they're doing in their own lives. And so, especially with trauma. And so I'm quick to let people know, hey, that was not me. That was all you. Right? I'm simply somebody that is literally paid to do this work. So it's not only is it my job, it's my passion, but we have to figure out how you can do these things without me. And hopefully, and maybe that'll take 3 years. And that's okay. We'll work together for those 3 years until we get there, right? But letting people have the agency is huge.
Absolutely. Well, and I mean, if you say it takes a few years, it's going to take way longer if you're not allowing them to instill choice in their lives from early on, right? And I think with the way the system has sort of changed over time, like we can't expect people to have full trust in the system. That would just be unfair, right?
And let's look at the pieces that are impacting people, right? So extreme poverty, right? Justice systems, mental health services, right? Social services, their income, right? Government systems. There's all sorts of pieces that are constantly sending a signal to them that they shouldn't have better.
Yeah.
Everybody you see around that's shopping and doing this and doing that, you're not part of that.
Yeah.
Right? And that is something that impacts people's overall confidence, their well-being, all sorts of pieces. So it's tough. Sometimes you'll meet people that are experiencing homelessness that will not look at you, right? And that's because their confidence has been drilled down. And people are passing them in the streets and they're not looking at them.
Yeah.
So it's also on us. What kind of message are we sending to people we won't even look them in the eyes?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? They're not part of the street, they're a human.
Exactly.
Right? And so when people ask me if I could give them any advice around street-involved individuals and what they could do for them, I say look them in the eyes and ask them how they're doing.
Exactly.
That's big. Some people might not have had somebody ask them that for months. Like, we don't actually know what's going on in people's heads, right? So the quicker we learn that, the better we can do for folks.
Treat them as a person. They are a person. They're having human experience. We're all having human experience.
Yeah. It's tough, right? It is not an easy thing for somebody to experience homelessness.
Absolutely.
Right? So if us as service providers with, a certain amount of privilege can make that journey even the slightest bit easier, that is something that I tell all the staff that I work with to hang their hats on, right? You did anything to alleviate the stress of their day, you did a good job,
Exactly.
right?
Sometimes that's all you can do in a day, right? And I think that that's something everyone can probably take from this. I know, so I used to live in the city of Toronto, and I can't even count how many times in a day you would see people just completely walking by someone who is asking for money on the street or whatever it is. But what a dehumanizing thing. And how do you expect people to have the self-worth to put in that time for themselves if no one else is showing up for them, right? So I think that even what you said about, you're showing up for clients even to the point where they're surprised you're still showing up, like that's huge.
Yeah.
That's so huge.
I just wanted to finalize for the 7th time that you still want to finalize. Because we just have to make sure that it wasn't a bad day. It wasn't their ability not to be able to emotionally regulate because they were never taught, right? Like we have to think about certain things that have happened in our development in life, and was there parent involvement or family supports or things that some of our folks that we're supporting did not have, right? So I always like to think, maybe 1% of what's actually going on here, right? Because that's a good way for me to check myself. We all want to think we have great grasps on what we do and we're so well thought out and strategic, right? But at the end of the day, people are going to make a decision whether I tell them what's good or bad or not, right? But I'd like them to at least have that information and then they can make the decision. decision, right?
And
so,
like we go through again an extensive amount of training on trauma informed and all of that, but the amount like that helps, but still what you learn in the field is still so much more.
absolutely.
And what your clients can teach you is
it's not in a book.
no, it
right?
isn't.
Yeah.
It isn't.
And-
It really like they're in all honesty, I think they teach the amount that they have taught me is more than I think I teach them sometimes. Like
Yeah.
it's
Mhm.
or the amount that they've given me is they're just
It's so true, right? And
or
there's
just like the mindset
Mhm.
of how thankful I am that I'm able to be in this role or able to have worked on as a service coordinator.
That's it,
Like it's
right?
it's truly
the day someone gets housed, these things are big, right? They're so big.
Absolutely.
And so I'm quick to let the staff know, like, hey, you know what you did there was massive, right? Because sometimes it's just like, well, I got to get this done, and then this done, and this done, and sometimes people get lost in the shuffle,
Yeah.
right? Not really recognizing, hey, you just had a huge impact on somebody's life, right?
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
so that's a big one for me. And like even as I mentioned, right, like, you know, really giving people the time of day, right? That's an important piece, right? We're only here one time, so if we're going to be, you know, looking at one of our societal ills, which homelessness is, in a country
Absolutely.
full of resources like
Absolutely.
Canada, we really don't have any excuse for why there's so many people experiencing homelessness.
Yeah.
And so when I first started doing this work, my mom would consistently compare, you know, to Ireland. My mom would always be like, yeah, it's very rampant in Ireland too, and she would ask me, what should I be doing when I'm there, and this and that. I said, well, ask them how they're doing, right? And so, funny enough, this story is quite funny because people are consistently stigmatizing people that are sitting on the streets or asking for money. And so my mom was going into Starbucks. She was about to get in a cab to get to the airport to come back to Canada. And a man was asking for some change to get a tea. And so my mom said, absolutely. She reached into her purse, she put change into his cup, and then she went into Starbucks. When she came out, the guy was gone. And then she was standing at the curb kind of waiting for the cab to come. When she looked to her right, the man was running towards her. And so in her brain, because we all have biases, we all have, you know, the stigma that we apply to people experiencing homelessness, she was a little panicked, right? There's a man that she's given change to, and now he's running down the street at her. And so when she's telling me this story, I can almost see her in the streets of Dublin, this happening, right? And the guy came back because when she put that pile of change into his cup, a piece of her jewelry was in there.
Oh
wow.
And so he was bringing back a piece of her jewelry, right? So this idea that, you know, the only problems that happen in our society are consistently the homeless population, I think it's a dumping ground for blame whenever we have
Absolutely.
issues in our communities.
Absolutely.
And so it's like, well, it's easy. It must be the homeless population. Oh, somebody damaged this or somebody did some theft there.
Mhm.
Sure, there's time where the homeless population are committing crime. We know that, right? There's desperation, and there is going to be a need for people to access things they need.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't mean that every issue that happens in your community can be quickly attributed to the homeless population.
But that also
Absolutely.
speaks to if there is rising issues, how can we best address it?
And it's collaboratively.
Yes, exactly.
It is working with business owners, working
Yes.
with cities,
Mhm.
working with social service agencies,
Yeah.
working with, honestly, your bylaw,
Mm-hmm.
the police system. It's
Which
coordination.
is something, in all, I feel like we can do a better job at.
Absolutely, without a doubt, and we are working on systems as well from our
Yes.
end, from like the street involved, you know,
Yeah.
workers that are hitting the pavement,
Mhm.
and also having a connection with police as well, where maybe the approach of the police responding to a call doesn't make sense. Somebody simply existing, right? And so
Yeah.
a softer approach from somebody that has been trained in trauma.
Which
We'll probably
we
get-
we do have the youth crisis response team,
Yep.
which is relatively new. I think this year.
It's a newer one.
It
Yep.
is a newer one, so I feel like in terms of mental health,
The
like
integration of social work
the
into
integration
the
of
policing, yeah.
social, I think that's necessary. But,
Huge, and it's not to any fault of policing.
No,
It just wasn't in
isn't.
training that they were
Was,
being-
and again, the police services are already very busy.
Oh, and they just in general, there's calls that are not, you know, it's not suitable
Mhm.
for a police officer to be attending,
Exactly.
right? So
Absolutely.
when we're talking about mental health breaks, sometimes we need to, you know, their proper support might be the one that convinces them to get into an ambulance,
Mhm.
right? And that's the great outcome that we want. Sometimes our folks are going to be in hospital because their mental health is so severe. And I
Yeah.
always tell workers, like, that's where they should be. That's a good thing. When they get
Yes.
out,
We're very
the
accepting of that.
right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Service access is tough.
Yeah.
So we need more beds in hospital, we need more beds in shelter, we need more affordable housing. Like I could
Afford,
go on and on,
yeah.
right? But
Absolutely.
in general, the lack of resources is a huge barrier for sure.
For sure. As we were talking about all of this, it was kind of making me think about like this whole not in my backyard mentality with like stigma and like when police are called for certain things. And one thing I know a woman from our local OPP had told me was a consistent, I guess, trend in our community, and I'm sure others as well, is when you see someone with like a shopping cart full of items and your brain immediately goes to, oh, well, they stole all of that. They've been stealing things all over town or what have you.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, most of those people, if they're experiencing homelessness, that's where they're keeping their personal belongings.
Everything,
Especially in a community like Leamington, we don't have anywhere for that kind of storage, right?
Yeah.
So I just thought it was really interesting and really ties into that not in my backyard mentality where how quick we are to I guess write off things as being done by those who are experiencing
It's so
homelessness
true.
when they're not.
And when we talk about people exiting homelessness, barriers, a shopping cart could be one.
yeah.
So sometimes we don't think about that. So then
Yeah.
when we're talking about how do we individualize supports and make it work for one person and not a one-size-fits-all type of model, well, two workers will meet that guy on the viewing day, and one will go with the shopping cart and hang out with the shopping cart for 20 minutes,
Mhm.
while the other colleague goes and takes the client to see a unit. Because
Okay.
showing up to a viewing with the cart will probably not get you the unit, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So we as the people that have resource, we have to figure it out
Mhm.
for those folks, right? Because like you said, that shopping cart is everything they own.
Exactly.
So we have to value those belongings.
Yeah.
Whether we think it's something you got from a garbage can or not, that doesn't matter,
Exactly.
right? It's what they have. And so belongings are important,
Person-centered.
right? We get our apartments, we get homes, and we fill them with our belongings. And if
Mhm.
someone came in and said, oh, that's garbage, we would take huge offense,
Yeah.
right? And so I think we have to afford people that same courtesy.
Exactly. And then also in regards to like obstacles, like an obstacle for like individuals seeking homelessness, especially in a rural setting, would be the fact that currently in Essex County we don't have any shelter services.
Absolutely.
Well, at least in Essex County, we do have Windsor, which
But you're right, it's a huge geographical area
It is
with
a-
transportation barriers
yes,
as well.
which
Absolutely.
again you
Right.
can speak to because you're in Amherstburg.
Yeah.
So I think again being a service provider out in Essex County, I'm in Leamington, so I think that is something to speak to.
Huge.
Absolutely.
We're a
for
massive
sure.
area.
We
right?
are. So
Geographically, it's huge.
yeah, I think that is.
Yeah, well, and let's be honest, there are so many folks who would prefer not to seek shelter in
Yep.
Windsor, right?
Yes,
We talk about
because their
having
social,
this sense
their
of
social
agency.
supports are in the county,
Yep,
so they do not
absolutely.
want to go to Windsor.
Some
so.
people might have jobs here,
Absolutely, family. Medical services.
treatments, whatever it
Anything,
is.
yeah.
Yeah.
They
And
might
so to
need
ask someone
recovery.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
There's lots of different things that keep people with their communities. I think that at the end of the day, you're in your community,
yeah,
right? Like,
exactly.
if I'm going to
Exactly.
champion people's abilities to be agents of themselves,
Mhm.
it doesn't say like you must come into the city to do this, right?
For sure.
So like I understand it completely. It's
Some
tough.
people may find Windsor triggering as well.
There's
or
just a
whatever.
lot of hurdles when you're located a lot
Exactly.
further away from service centers,
Absolutely.
A lot more.
Absolutely.
right?
So,
Yeah, that is a big piece of the puzzle. I have one final question.
Awesome. Let's hear it.
It's a bit of a loaded one, and I
Okay.
will say it's something we've kind of, touched on a little bit through our conversation. We've had such a good conversation. We've touched on lots of things, but it maybe goes back to the beginning before housing first even was a concept, but
Yeah.
along that line of thought, how I guess as the system overall evolving and changing, and I guess what are your major hopes for where you see things going with this work, I guess.
7 years ago when we started doing the work, I mean myself, or when the program launched, the Housing First Intervention for Windsor Essex, Canada didn't have a housing strategy, so that helped, a federal housing strategy.
Yeah.
They didn't have a way of dishing out funds around combating homelessness. Now it's very rigid. Reaching home, is the way that the funding comes from the feds, and it's specific. You have to have a centralized access. You have to have a by names prioritized list. You have to be operating in a housing first framework. I think that the reason why that's being mandated by the government is because that has the best results, right? So that's the piece that I think. So for me, those are the pieces that give me hope.
it's evidence based.
Absolutely.
Yes, that we'll get to a point where we can look at functional zero, have people entering homelessness at the same time as exiting it.
What is functional zero?
So functional zero is a term used in the housing sector around that people are entering homelessness at the same rate that they're exiting it. So let's say 2 people are being added to the by names list every day, but 2 people are getting housed, right? And so that would be the rate where you've reached functional zero. And then you have to maintain that for a period of time. And so communities like Medicine Hat, they eradicated chronic homelessness, right? And communities across the U.S. have eradicated chronic homelessness, veterans homelessness. London here locally is not too far, has reached functional zero with regards to their veterans homelessness.
We are now tracking our veterans homelessness
Yes,
stats.
I think we're on track to get there too.
Awesome.
I really do. For me, every win is important, right? And
Absolutely.
so it's great to be striving for functional zero, but it's also a massive win of getting Johnny off the streets,
Absolutely.
right? So we have to find that balance. Sure, I jump out of bed a lot quicker in the mornings of a housing day, but that doesn't make the days that are not housing days any less important.
Celebrating the big wins and the little victories,
You got it.
right? Yeah,
Absolutely.
for sure.
Absolutely.
I agree with everything Colin said. I think the system's changed a lot. When I started, probably 6 months before the by names list kind of came in, and it was exciting to me, the idea of it. So I've kind of seen that change kind of come around. I think the more data that we get, it's just exciting. I get to add people to the by names list, which is exciting. I don't know. I think the more collaboratively we continue to work together, I'm a big rural homelessness is something I'm really passionate about because I live rural. So I think as we continue to work and work together on addressing these issues,
And some of the pieces, just to piggyback off of that, the response of the system during COVID that made homelessness kind of an emergency issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
We need that constantly.
Yeah,
I will say, they really, the city addressed COVID. They really jumped at it, and so congrats.
A lot of people worked really
Yes.
hard. I was fortunate to be part of the coordinating and seeing agencies, kind of loosen the grip on resources
For
and say
sure.
whatever we can do as a collaborative to get the most amount of people housed the quickest as possible, the better, because we were having outbreaks in our system. So if our system doesn't have shelter beds because they can't let new people get in, well, where are people going to go, right? And so I think that urgency is something I wish I could have bottled.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's so many lessons learned as a system
Yes.
from that period that I think we can continue to replicate. And hopefully people can start to treat the homelessness issue, governments included, like an emergency. Right?
Absolutely.
And some communities have declared a state of emergency around homelessness, around opiate overdoses. Those are pieces that are huge in our community, right? So hopefully we're seeing a little bit. We're slowly seeing our community get a little bit more progressive with regards to a safe injection site. So hopefully we'll see some of that momentum really carry us into helping more folks. That's what matters.
Yeah, for sure. I'm hopeful for that too. I think, as you both said, the pandemic really showed us. Well, I mean, a lot of us just hadn't really considered it before that. And I'll speak for myself because I actually wasn't in this work at that time, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of these issues, especially in a rural community, like having public washrooms that are accessible 24/7, are things that I personally had never had to consider.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really until the pandemic that I'd considered them for anyone else.
Or
right?
having
So-
libraries, having library
Yeah.
access for
Somewhere to get air conditioning.
Absolutely.
If it's 100 degrees outside.
or
Right.
housing searches, right?
Yeah.
I think there's some things out there, but I think the city and the county did really
They did jump to it.
they really
absolutely
did jump
Yep.
to it.
And I think with that same kind of vigorously
Momentum,
commitment, not just from our municipal governments, but also from the
Federal.
nonprofit agencies, from people delivering housing supports. There was just a lot of collaboration that I saw. It was really beautiful, and I think there's a lot to be pulled from there.
Which I
Absolutely.
think, right, that's key. I don't find it's not necessary for, this agency to be offering this service and this agency to be offering this service, right? Let's collaboratively decide what is being offered so that we can forward in the best
Absolutely.
way.
Well, that's the thing, right? People are more successful with services that fit their needs.
Exactly.
So collaboration is the goal,
Mhm.
right? And that's why the government is mandating binding prioritized lists.
Yes.
You know, collaboration is, no matter what, as hard as it may be to work with people in different agencies that have different policies and different ways of doing things, it's worth it, right? You have to work collaboratively with people, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that collaboration piece, in terms of the homelessness service system and looking at the pandemic as a whole, like there are certain things that, our world changed, let's be
really
real, right?
did,
There were
dramatically.
certain ways that we adapted overnight, and then certain things that we've, I think, carried forward into this sort of new normal with us.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
hopefully that, collaboration and coordination is one of those pieces that sticks around long term. And then, I really have to commend you both for the work you're doing and being a part of that as well. I think as long as we have great people like you involved in the system who are really working hard to make positive changes on an individual level and on a system whole level, that's how we're going to get where we need to be.
It's true,
So.
right? Support your local homeless population. There's
For
people in your
sure.
community in need, and if the best thing you can do is donate to a food bank, that's amazing.
Yeah,
If you
it's-
could do, any type of thing is helping the system, right? So
Yeah, and I think for anyone listening as well, like if you're able to be a bit intentional about how you integrate that into your everyday life. So I know a lot of people, especially in the county when I started in this role, like just friends and family or what have you, would ask about, keeping materials in their car, for example. And I'm like, that's great. And I do it as well, but I'd also drop some off to organizations that are actually going to be connecting with folks,
Yeah.
right? So it's,
Yeah.
for
it's
sure.
just those little ways that you
Yep.
kind of are intentional and thoughtful about how you integrate it into your everyday life.
It's true, and the churches,
Mhm.
local groups, the amount of donations that actually do get right into the hands of the folks we're supporting,
Yes.
it is vast. Like people
Yeah.
are doing a great deal of giving with their
Yeah.
hearts, right? So
Absolutely.
it has to be commended that the community is it really does do a good job in that aspect.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you both for being here. This was such a great discussion.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Thank
I,
you so much.
especially after this, feel so hopeful about the way we're moving. So, thank you both.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate your time.
For those who are interested in learning more about the Leamington Homelessness Project, you can visit South Essex Community Council's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts at South Essex CC, or visit secc.on.ca/homelessness. Through this site, you'll be able to find additional information on the community services offered by South Essex Community Council. That's all for today, and tune in next Thursday for more.